On the morning of September 15th, 1945, Captain Giuseppe Rossi walked into a converted warehouse in the northern Italian town of Brescia. The war in Europe had ended 4 months earlier. Mussolini was dead. The Italian Social Republic had collapsed, and Rossi, formerly an officer in the Regio Esercito, now worked for the transitional Italian government, helping to rebuild what remained of his country's shattered military. Rossi was an engineer by training, a small arms specialist who had spent the war years working with Italy's arsenals and proving grounds. He understood rifles. He understood the Carcano. He had carried one himself during the early years of the war, before his technical expertise pulled him away from the front lines and into the workshops where Italy's weapons were tested and evaluated. The warehouse held rows of captured American equipment, jeeps, radios, ammunition crates, medical supplies, and rifles. Hundreds of rifles. Most were still packed in cosmoline, stacked in wooden crates, stamped with U.S. Army markings. Springfield Armory, Winchester, International Harvester. Rossi had been sent to evaluate them. The Italian military needed to standardize its small arms, needed to decide what rifles would equip the post-war Italian army. The British were offering surplus Lee-Enfields. The Americans were offering M1 Garands, and Italy still had warehouses full of Carcanos, millions of them, serviceable rifles that could continue serving for years if the government chose to keep them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Rossi pulled an M1 Garand from its crate. The rifle was heavier than a Carcano, almost 10 pounds loaded compared to just over 8 pounds for the Italian rifle. The wood stock was American walnut, darker than the light-coloured beech or birch used on Carcanos. The metal was finished in a dark park, irisation that looked almost black in the warehouse light. He worked. The action. Smooth. Precise. The operating rod slid back and forth with mechanical confidence. He loaded an 8-round en-bloc clip into the internal magazine. The clip snapped into place with a distinctive metallic ping. He chambered a round. The bolt closed with authority. Then he walked outside, to the firing range that had been set up behind the warehouse. The range was crude, just packed earth and wooden target frames at 50, 100, and 200 meters. But it was enough. Rossi needed to understand this rifle, needed to know if the stories he had heard were true, because the stories from Italian soldiers who had fought against the Americans were consistent, terrifyingly consistent. American infantry could fire faster than Italian infantry, much faster. An American rifleman with an M1 Garand could put rounds down range at a rate that made Italy's bolt-action Carcanos seem painfully slow by comparison. Rossi had dismissed some of these reports as exaggeration. Combat produces fear, and fear produces distortion. Soldiers under fire always overestimate enemy capabilities, but the reports kept coming, from Tunisia, from Sicily. Italian prisoners of war, interrogated by their own officers after repatriation, described the same experience. When Italian infantry engaged American infantry, the volume of fire was unequal, dramatically unequal. An 8-man American rifle squad could deliver more aimed fire in 30 seconds than a comparable Italian squad could deliver in 2 minutes. Rossi raised the Garand to his shoulder. The sights aligned naturally. He fired. The rifle recoiled smoothly, the gas-operated mechanism cycling automatically, ejecting the spent case and chambering the next round. He fired again, and again. 8 rounds, in rapid succession, each shot requiring only a trigger pull. No bolt to manipulate. No interruption in his sight picture. Just aim, fire, aim, fire, aim. The clip ejected with a loud ping. He reloaded. 8 more rounds, 8 more rapid shots. He fired all 8 clips he had brought with. 64 rounds in less than 3 minutes, every one of them an aimed shot. Then he picked up a Carcano Modello 1991. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, lighter than the Garand. The bolt action smooth from decades of refinement. He loaded a 6-round en bloc clip, chambered a round, and began firing. fire, work the bolt, eject, chamber, fire, work the bolt, eject, chamber, fire. The Carcano was not slow. A trained soldier could fire 12 to 15 aimed rounds per minute with a bolt-action rifle. That was the standard, the rate that Italian infantry had been trained to achieve since the rifle's adoption in 1891, but compared to the Garand, 12 rounds per minute felt glacial. Rossi fired 64 rounds with the Carcano. It took him just over 5 minutes, more than twice as long as the Garand, and that was shooting at a relaxed pace, with no incoming fire, no stress, no fear. He set both rifles on the table and walked to the target frames. The hits were comparable. Both rifles were accurate. Both were reliable. The Carcano was, in fact, a perfectly adequate military rifle by the standards of 1915 or even 1940. But this was 1945. And the standards had changed. Rossi understood in that moment what Italian infantrymen had learned the hard way on battlefields across the Mediterranean. The M1 Garand did not just fire faster, it fundamentally changed infantry combat. It allowed American riflemen to maintain fire without breaking their stance, without lowering their weapon, without taking their eyes off the target. A bolt-action rifleman had to interrupt his shooting to cycle the bolt. That interruption was brief, perhaps half a second for a well-trained soldier, but it was an interruption nonetheless. The rifle came down. The sight picture was lost. The soldier's attention shifted from the target to the mechanism. With a semi-automatic rifle, there was no interruption. The soldier aimed, fired, and the rifle was ready to fire again. The rhythm was continuous. The pressure on the enemy was relentless. Rossi had read reports from the Italian campaign, reports from German officers who had faced the Americans in Sicily and on the mainland. The Germans, equipped with their excellent Carabiner 98K Mauser rifles, had noted the same problem. American infantry squads produced a higher volume of fire than German squads, even though the Car 98K was arguably the finest bolt-action rifle ever manufactured. One German report, written by an officer who had fought in Sicily, stated that American infantry tactics were built around the assumption of continuous semi-automatic fire. American riflemen advanced behind suppressive fire from their own rifles. German and Italian infantry advanced behind machine gun fire, because bolt-action rifles could not produce enough volume to suppress an enemy position effectively. The mathematics were simple. An American infantry squad consisted of 12 men. If 8 of them carried M1 Garands and could fire 30 to 40 rounds per minute each, the squad could deliver over 240 rounds per minute of aimed rifle fire. An Italian squad of similar size, equipped with bolt-action Carcanos, could deliver perhaps 90 to 100 rounds per minute. The difference was not marginal, it was overwhelming. Rossi walked back to the warehouse. He needed to write his report. He needed to explain to his superiors what he had discovered. But the conclusion was already clear in his mind. Italy could not continue using the Carcano as its standard infantry rifle, not if the Italian army hoped to be taken seriously by its NATO allies, not if Italian infantry expected to fight alongside American or British forces in any future conflict. The age of the bolt-action rifle was over. The Americans had proven that. They had proven it on every battlefield where their infantry had fought, from North Africa to Sicily to Normandy to Germany itself. But Rossi's understanding of the M1 Garand's superiority was not based on his own test firing. It was based on something far more compelling. It was based on the testimony of men who had faced the Garand in combat and lived to describe the experience. Because by September of 1945, Italy had tens of thousands of former prisoners of war who had been repatriated from American and British captivity. These men had stories. And those stories, collected and analysed by Italian military intelligence, painted a clear picture of what modern infantry combat looked like when one side had semi-automatic rifles and the other did not. The first detailed Italian reports about American firepower superiority came from North Africa. In May of 1943, when Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered, over 240,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners of war. Among them were approximately 60,000 Italians, who had fought against American forces during the final months of the North African campaign. These prisoners were interrogated. Standard procedure for captured enemy combatants. The Americans wanted tactical intelligence. The British wanted operational information. And when the war ended and the prisoners began returning to Italy, the Italian military conducted its own interviews, trying to understand what had gone wrong, trying to learn from defeat. One of those prisoners was Sergeant Aldo Marchetti, an infantry squad leader from the Ariete Armoured Division. Marchetti had been captured near Tunis on April 28, 1943, after his position was overrun by American infantry from the 1st Infantry Division. In his debriefing, conducted in October of 1945 after his return to Italy, Marchetti described his final engagement with American forces. His squad had been defending a low ridge overlooking a valley. They had good positions, decent fields of fire. 8 men with Carcano rifles and 1 man with a Breda Modello 30 light machine gun. The Americans attacked at dawn. Marchetti estimated 1 platoon, perhaps 30 men, advancing in small groups across broken ground. His machine gunner opened fire. The Americans went to ground. Standard infantry tactics. The machine gun fired in bursts, trying to pin the Americans in place while Marchetti's riflemen engaged targets of opportunity. Then something changed. The volume of incoming fire increased dramatically. Marchetti described it as sounding like multiple machine guns, but he could see the muzzle flashes. They were rifles, individual American soldiers, firing so rapidly that the sound merged into a continuous roar. Marchetti's men returned fire. But working the bolt on a Carcano took time. Fire, bolt back, eject, bolt, forward, chamber, fire. Perhaps 15 rounds per minute for a well-trained soldier. His 8 riflemen together could deliver maybe 120 rounds per minute. The Americans, Marchetti estimated, were putting at least 200 rounds per minute onto his position. And they were, advancing while they fired. Moving in short rushes, one group providing covering fire, while another group moved forward, then switching roles. Marchetti's machine gunner was hit. Then 2 of his riflemen. The incoming fire was too intense, too accurate. Marchetti ordered a withdrawal. His squad fell back, losing 2 more men in the process. The Americans took the ridge within 15 minutes. In his debriefing, Marchetti was asked what weapon the Americans had been using. He said he did not know at the time. He had assumed they had light machine guns, but after being captured, he saw the rifles up close. M1 Garands, semi-automatic, 8-round capacity, gas-operated. The interrogating Italian officer asked Marchetti to estimate how many rounds his squad had fired during the engagement. Marchetti estimated perhaps 200 rounds total, over approximately 15 minutes, from 8 riflemen and 1 machine gun before it was knocked out. The officer then asked how many rounds Marchetti thought the Americans had fired. Marchetti paused. He said he could not be certain. But the incoming fire had been constant, overwhelming. He estimated at least 400 rounds, possibly more. The mathematics supported this. If the American platoon had 20 men with M1 Garands, firing 30 rounds per minute each, they could deliver 600 rounds per minute. In 15 minutes, that was 9,000 rounds theoretically possible. In reality, allowing for movement, reloading, and tactical pauses, they had probably fired between 1,000 and 2,000 rounds. Marchetti's squad had been outgunned by a factor of 5 to 1, possibly 10 to 1. The outcome was inevitable. This pattern repeated across hundreds of debriefing reports. Italian soldiers described being overwhelmed by American firepower. They described the distinctive sound of M1 Garands firing in rapid succession. They described the psychological effect of facing continuous rifle fire, something they had never experienced before. One corporal from the Centauro division described an engagement in Tunisia where his company attempted to counterattack an American position. The company advanced in a line, approximately 100 men, across open ground. The Americans, estimated at perhaps 50 men, opened fire at 200 meters. The corporal said the sound was like heavy rain on a metal roof, continuous, unending. His company took casualties immediately. Men fell. The advance stalled. The company commander ordered them to go to ground and return fire. But firing from prone positions with bolt-action rifles was difficult. The soldier had to maintain his aim, pull the trigger, then break his sight picture to work the bolt, then reacquire the target. It was slow. It was awkward. The Americans, with their semi-automatic rifles, simply aimed and fired, aimed and fired, aimed and fired. The Italian counterattack collapsed within 5 minutes. The company withdrew, having suffered 30% casualties. The corporal was captured 2 days later when his unit ran out of ammunition and surrendered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By July of 1943, when the Allies invaded Sicily, Italian military intelligence had compiled enough prisoner testimony to understand the tactical implications of the M1 Garand. Reports were distributed to Italian commanders, warning them about American firepower superiority and recommending tactical adjustments. The recommendations were sensible but difficult to implement. Italian infantry should avoid open-ground engagements with American infantry. Italian forces should maximize the use of machine guns and automatic weapons to compensate for the slower rate of fire from bolt-action rifles. Italian infantry should take advantage of defensive positions and obstacles to reduce American mobility, but tactical recommendations could only do so much. The fundamental problem was not tactics, it was technology. The Americans had semi-automatic rifles, the Italians had bolt-action rifles. In any direct engagement between comparable forces, the Americans could deliver 2 to 3 times more firepower. The invasion of Sicily provided additional evidence. The Italian Sixth Army, defending the island, included coastal divisions, mobile divisions, and several independent regiments. Most were equipped with Carcano rifles, though some units had captured British or French weapons. When American forces landed at Gela on July 10, 1943, they encountered elements of the Italian Livorno Division and the Italian Mobile Group E. The fighting was intense. The Italians fought harder than Allied intelligence had expected, but the outcome was never in doubt. American after-action reports from Sicily noted that Italian defensive positions were often well prepared and stubbornly defended. But once American infantry closed with Italian positions, the volume of fire from M1 Garands overwhelmed the defenders. Italian soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles could not produce enough firepower to stop American infantry assaults. One American company commander described an engagement near Gela where his unit assaulted an Italian strongpoint on a hill. The position was defended by approximately 30 Italian soldiers with rifles and 1 machine gun. The American company, roughly 100 men, assaulted uphill across open ground. The Italian machine gun fired. American soldiers went to ground. Then the American riflemen began firing. The company commander described it as a mad minute of continuous rifle fire, every man with an M1 Garand firing as fast as he could pull the trigger. The volume of fire was so intense that the Italian defenders could not raise their heads to return fire effectively. The Italian machine gunner was suppressed. The American infantry advanced under covering fire from their own rifles, something that would have been impossible with bolt-action weapons. The position was overrun in less than 10 minutes. 23 Italian soldiers surrendered. 7 were dead or wounded. The American company suffered 4 casualties. The commander noted in his report that the M1 Garand had been decisive in the assault. The ability to deliver continuous semi-automatic fire while advancing had allowed his men to suppress the enemy without requiring heavy machine gun support. By the time Italy signed the armistice on September 8, 1943, the Italian military had collected extensive evidence about American infantry tactics and firepower. The evidence was clear, the evidence was consistent, and the evidence was damning. Italian bolt-action rifles were obsolete. Not mechanically obsolete, the Carcano was a reliable and accurate weapon, but tactically obsolete. In modern infantry combat, where firepower and suppression determined the outcome of engagements, a semi-automatic rifle was not just better than a bolt-action rifle, it was fundamentally superior. After the armistice, Italy split. The South aligned with the Allies. The North remained under German control as the Italian Social Republic. But both sides faced the same reality. Italian infantry, equipped with Carcanos, could not match American infantry equipped with Garands. Some Italian units fighting alongside the Allies were re-equipped with British Lee-Enfield rifles. The Lee-Enfield was a bolt-action rifle, but it had a 10-round magazine and an exceptionally fast bolt-action that allowed trained soldiers to fire 20 to 30 rounds per minute, nearly double the rate of the Carcano. But even the Lee-Enfield was inferior to the M1 Garand. The Garand could fire 40 to 50 rounds per minute in sustained fire, and that rate could be maintained for as long as ammunition lasted. A bolt-action rifle, no matter how fast the action, required the shooter to interrupt his aim to cycle the bolt. Italian officers who observed American infantry in action during the Italian campaign wrote detailed reports about American tactics. These reports were collected and analyzed. They described how American infantry squads advanced using fire and movement, with riflemen providing covering fire for each other. They described how American platoons assaulted prepared positions using suppressive fire from M1 Garands to keep defenders' heads down, while assault elements closed the distance. One Italian liaison officer, attached to an American regiment during the fighting near Monte Cassino in early 1944, wrote that American infantry operated on the assumption that every rifleman could deliver suppressive fire. This assumption shaped everything: unit organization, tactics, doctrine. German infantry operated on the assumption that suppressive fire came from machine guns. Riflemen were important, but their primary role was to support the machine guns. The MG-34 and MG-42 were the center of German infantry tactics. Riflemen with Kar-98K Mausers protected the machine guns and exploited the suppression the machine guns created. American infantry operated on a different assumption. Suppressive fire came from everyone. Every rifleman with an M1 Garand could pin an enemy position. Every squad could deliver enough firepower to suppress a platoon-sized defensive position. This fundamental difference in doctrine was possible because of the M1 Garand's semi-automatic action. Without that technology, American tactics would not have worked. The Italian liaison officer concluded his report with a stark assessment. Italy's infantry doctrine, built around bolt-action rifles and heavy machine guns, was a generation behind American doctrine. To compete with modern armies, Italy would need to adopt semi-automatic rifles as standard issue. But in 1944, Italy was in no position to manufacture new rifles. The country was a battleground. Industry was destroyed or operating at minimal capacity. The arsenals at Brescia, Terni, and Turin were damaged or captured. When the war ended in May of 1945, Italy faced a choice. The Italian military needed to rebuild, needed to standardize equipment, needed to decide what rifles would equip Italian infantry in the post-war era. The obvious answer was the M1 Garand. The Americans were producing them by the hundreds of thousands. Surplus Garands were available through military aid programs, and Italy's experience fighting against the Garand had demonstrated its superiority beyond any doubt. But adopting the Garand meant more than just acquiring rifles. It meant changing doctrine. It meant retraining officers and NCOs to think about infantry combat differently. It meant accepting that Italy's traditional approach to small arms, built on bolt-action rifles and careful aimed fire, was obsolete. Captain Rossi understood this when he fired the M1 Garand at the range in Brescia in September of 1945. The rifle in his hands was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of how warfare had changed. It represented a shift in thinking, a transformation in the fundamental nature of infantry combat. When Rossi wrote his evaluation report, he was careful to be objective. He noted the Garand's weight. He noted its complexity compared to the simple Carcano. He noted that training Italian soldiers to use the Garand would require time and resources, but his conclusion was unambiguous. The M1 Garand was superior to the Carcano in every tactical metric that mattered: rate of fire, volume of fire, effectiveness in suppressing enemy positions, suitability for fire and movement tactics. Rossi recommended that Italy adopt the M1 Garand as its standard infantry rifle. He recommended that existing Carcano stocks be relegated to reserve units or sold as surplus. He recommended that Italian infantry doctrine be revised to incorporate American-style fire and movement tactics. His report was one of many. Other Italian officers had reached the same conclusion. Some had reached it through combat, experience, others through observation, still others through simple mathematical analysis of fire rates and tactical effectiveness. By late 1945, the decision was essentially made. Italy would adopt the M1 Garand. The only questions were logistics. How many rifles? From what source? Over what timeline? The formal adoption process took time. Italy, in 1945, was not a unified nation making clear decisions. The country was occupied, divided, economically devastated. The government in Rome had limited authority. The military was being rebuilt from fragments. But by 1947, the outline of Italy's post-war defense structure became clear. Italy would align with the Western powers. It would eventually join NATO, and its military would standardize on Western equipment. In 1950, Brescia began manufacturing M1 Garand rifles under license. The tooling came from Winchester, purchased as surplus from American factories that had ramped down production after the war. Brescia also began producing Garands. By 1952, Italian factories were turning out M1 rifles at a rate of several thousand per month. The irony was not lost on Italian veterans. The rifle that had devastated Italian infantry in North Africa and Sicily was now being manufactured in Italian arsenals. The weapon that had proven Italy's Carcano obsolete was now being produced in the same factories that had once made Carcanos. But the transition was not just about manufacturing rifles. It was about changing an entire military culture. Italian infantry doctrine in 1940 had been based on concepts that dated back to the First World War. Infantry advanced behind artillery barrages. Riflemen fired carefully, aimed shots at identified targets. Machine guns provided suppressive fire. The bolt-action rifle was seen as a precision instrument, a tool for marksmanship rather than volume of fire. This doctrine made sense in 1918. It made sense when every major army used bolt-action rifles, and the difference between armies was training, discipline, and the quality of machine gun support. But by 1943, American doctrine had evolved beyond those assumptions. American infantry doctrine emphasized firepower over precision, suppression over careful, aimed fire. The ability to put rounds downrange quickly was valued more than the ability to make every shot count. This shift was possible because of the M1 Garand. A semi-automatic rifle allowed soldiers to fire rapidly without sacrificing too much accuracy. The rifle's gas-operated action absorbed recoil and kept the rifle stable between shots. A trained soldier could fire aimed shots at a rate that would have been impossible with a bolt-action rifle. Italian instructors, training the post-war Italian army on the M1 Garand, had to teach soldiers to think differently about rifle fire. A Carcano rifleman was trained to take his time, to make every shot count, to conserve ammunition. A Garand rifleman was trained to shoot faster, to use suppressive fire, to prioritize volume when the tactical situation required it. The differences were stark. An Italian infantry manual from 1940 instructed riflemen to fire no more than 15 aimed rounds per minute. Firing faster was considered wasteful and inaccurate. An American infantry manual from 1944 instructed riflemen that the M1 Garand's semi-automatic action allowed for rapid fire when needed. 40 to 50 rounds per minute was achievable. In combat, soldiers were encouraged to fire as fast as necessary to suppress the enemy or support an advance. Italian training cadres in the early 1950s struggled with this cultural shift. Older NCOs, veterans of the war, had been trained on bolt-action rifles. They understood marksmanship, they understood fire, discipline. But the American concept of using rifle fire for suppression, of firing multiple rounds rapidly to keep enemy heads down, felt wasteful to men who had fought in an army that was always short of ammunition. But the younger officers understood. They had read the after-action reports. They had spoken to veterans who had faced American infantry. They understood that modern infantry combat rewarded firepower, and firepower came from volume as much as from accuracy. One Italian training officer, Major Luca Ferretti, wrote in a 1953 report that Italian infantry had to unlearn the lessons of the last war and learn the lessons of the next war. The Carcano had taught Italian soldiers to be careful, conservative, precise. The Garand required them to be aggressive, confident, and willing to expend ammunition to achieve tactical objectives. Ferretti noted that Italian soldiers adapted quickly once they understood the weapon's capabilities. The Garand was heavier than the Carcano, but soldiers appreciated the reduced recoil and the smoother action. Loading the 8-round on-block clip was faster than loading individual rounds into a Carcano, and once, soldiers experienced the advantage of semi-automatic fire in training exercises. They became enthusiastic advocates for the weapon. By 1954, the Italian army was fully equipped with M1 Garands. The Carcano was relegated to reserve stocks, training rifles for civilian marksmanship programs, and eventually surplus sales to the civilian market. Millions of Carcanos were sold to American importers in the 1950s and early 1960s, flooding the U.S. surplus market with cheap Italian rifles. One of those rifles, a Carcano Modello 91/38 carbine, serial number C2766, was purchased by mail order in March of 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. On November 22nd of that year, Oswald used that rifle to assassinate President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. The irony was profound. An Italian rifle, declared obsolete by the Italian military in favor of the American M1 Garand, was used to kill the American president who had served in the U.S. Navy during World War II, the same war in which the Garand had proven its superiority. But by 1963, even the M1 Garand was becoming obsolete. The United States had adopted the M14 rifle in 1957, a selective fire weapon based on the Garand action but chambered in 7.62mm NATO and fed from a 20-round detachable box magazine. Italy followed suit. In 1959, Beretta developed the BM-59, essentially an M1 Garand modified to fire 7.62 NATO with a 20-round magazine, a selector switch for semi-automatic or full-automatic fire, and a folding bipod for use as a light support weapon. The BM-59 was Italy's answer to changing infantry doctrine. By the late 1950s, military theorists recognized that semi-automatic rifles were not the end of infantry weapons development. They were a transitional technology. The future belonged to selective fire rifles that could function as both precision weapons and automatic rifles, depending on the situation. But the M1 Garand had served its purpose. It had taught the Italian military and militaries around the world that semi-automatic fire was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Any modern army that expected to compete in infantry combat needed rifles that could deliver rapid, sustained fire, without requiring the soldier to interrupt his aim. The lessons learned from the Garand influenced every infantry rifle developed after 1945, the Soviet SKS and AK-47, the Belgian FN-FAL, the German G3, the American M14 and M16. All were semi-automatic or selective fire weapons. None were bolt-action. The age of the bolt-action service rifle ended because the M1 Garand proved that a better alternative existed. Soldiers, equipped with semi-automatic rifles, could deliver more firepower than soldiers with bolt-action rifles. That advantage was decisive in combat. And once that advantage was demonstrated conclusively on battlefields across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, no military could afford to ignore it. For Italy, The lesson was learned the hard way. Italian infantry in Tunisia and Sicily had faced American infantry equipped with Garands and had been overwhelmed by superior firepower. Italian prisoners of war had returned home with stories of being unable to match the volume of fire that American riflemen could produce. Italian officers had written reports documenting the tactical superiority of semi-automatic rifles, and, when the war ended, Italy made the only rational decision: abandon the Carcano, adopt the Garand, change doctrine to reflect the reality of modern infantry combat. Captain Giuseppe Rossi, the engineer who had test-fired both rifles in September of 1945, continued working for the term Italian military through the 1950s. He was involved in the adoption of the M1 Garand. He worked on the development of the BM-59. He saw Italian infantry doctrine transform from a bolt-action mentality to a semi-automatic mentality, to eventually a selective fire mentality. In a 1960 interview with an Italian military journal, Rossi reflected on the transition. He was asked what he considered the most significant change in Italian infantry equipment since the war. His answer was immediate: the M1 Garand, not because it was the best rifle ever made. By 1960, better rifles existed, but because it represented a fundamental shift in thinking about what infantry combat required. The Garand had proven that firepower mattered more than precision in most tactical situations. That volume of fire could suppress enemy positions, enable maneuver, and determine the outcome of engagements. Rossi said that when he had fired the Garand for the first time in 1945, he understood immediately why Italian infantry had struggled against American infantry. The difference was not training, it was not morale, it was not leadership, it was technology. The Carcano was a fine rifle for 1915, but warfare had changed, and Italy's failure to recognize that change had cost thousands of Italian soldiers their lives. The interviewer asked Rossi if he thought Italy could have developed its own semi-automatic rifle during the war. Rossi paused. He said that Italy had experimented with semi-automatic designs in the 1930s, but those projects had been abandoned due to cost, manufacturing complexity, and institutional resistance from officers who believed the bolt-action rifle was sufficient. By the time Italian military leaders recognized the need for semi-automatic rifles, it was too late. Italy lacked the industrial capacity, the resources, and the time to develop and produce a new rifle while fighting a losing war. So Italy adopted the weapon that had defeated it. The M1 Garand became the symbol of Italy's military modernization in the post-war era. Italian soldiers carried Garands through the 1950s. Italian factories produced Garands under license, and Italian doctrine was rewritten to incorporate the lessons that American infantry had learned through years of combat with the rifle that General Patton had called the greatest battle implement ever devised. The comparison between the Carcano and the Garand was not just about rate of fire, it was about two different philosophies of infantry combat. The Carcano represented a philosophy where riflemen were sharpshooters, where every round was carefully aimed, where fire discipline meant conserving ammunition and making every shot count. The Garand represented a philosophy where riflemen were suppressive fire platforms, where rapid fire could pin enemy forces, where fire discipline meant knowing when to shoot fast and when to shoot slow, but always maintaining the ability to deliver high volumes of fire when needed. Those philosophies produced different results on the battlefield. Italian infantry doctrine, built around the Carcano, emphasized defensive positions, careful fields of fire, and reliance on les partilles, machine guns for suppression. American infantry doctrine, built around the Garand, emphasized aggressive maneuver, fire and movement, and the assumption that every rifleman could contribute to suppressing the enemy. When those two doctrines collided in North Africa and Sicily, the outcome was predictable. American infantry could advance under their own covering fire. Italian infantry could not. American infantry could suppress enemy positions with rifle fire alone. Italian infantry required machine gun support. The tactical advantage was overwhelming, and it stemmed directly from the difference between a semi-automatic rifle and a bolt-action rifle. By the time the M1 Garand was retired from Italian service in the 1960s, It had served for over a decade as the standard Italian infantry rifle. It had equipped Italian forces during the critical post-war years, when Italy rebuilt its military and joined NATO. It had trained a generation of Italian soldiers to think about infantry combat in modern terms, and it had taught the Italian military a lesson that every military in the world eventually learned. Technology matters. The quality of a soldier's weapon can determine the outcome of battles, and institutional resistance to change, no matter how well-intentioned, can cost lives when that resistance prevents the adoption of superior technology. The story of the M1 Garand and the Carcano was not a story of Italian failure. It was a story of technological evolution. The Carcano had been an excellent rifle when it was adopted in 1891. It had served Italy well for over 50 years. But by 1940, it was obsolete, and Italy's inability to recognize that obsolescence had strategic consequences. The Americans had recognized the future of infantry small arms in the 1930s when they adopted the Garand. That recognition gave American infantry a decisive advantage in World War II, an advantage measured not in yards of territory or numbers of casualties, but in the fundamental ability of American riflemen to deliver more firepower than their opponents. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.